Cultivating the Sociome, Governance Without Governors, by Eric Moon. Chapter 5, Property. If we wish to understand the functioning of our sociome, another fundamental concept that we must understand on a deep level is property. The right to property is one of the three essential components of human rights proposed by the English philosopher John Locke, along with the right to liberty and the right to life. But what exactly is property? In any type of society, not just ours, there has to be some method of deciding what portion everyone gets from what everyone produces. And there are, in the broadest sense, two alternatives. Authority, based on hierarchy, or ownership, based on individual liberty. The reason there has to be a method for deciding who gets what is contained in the word scarcity. We need to understand what scarcity is and what it is not if we wish to achieve clarity of understanding. First of all, we must distinguish scarcity from shortage. And although these terms are often used interchangeably, calling two different things by the same name leads to confusion in an area where clarity is essential. Of course, if your aim is to sow confusion, conflating these words is a way to do so, with proven effectiveness. A shortage is defined as a condition in a market where the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied at a particular price. A shortage is typically temporary because shortages and their opposites, surpluses, can be eliminated by changes in prices or by changes in supply and demand conditions. A shortage is therefore a temporary market condition and not a fundamental condition of life. Scarcity, on the other hand, is defined as the difference between the total amount of stuff that there is to go around and the total amount of stuff we collectively want. And there is strong reason to assume that scarcity will always be with us as a fundamental condition of life, simply because the list of things we collectively want is endless and because resources are limited. In a hypothetical world like Alice's restaurant, where scarcity is not a thing, there would be no need for a method to decide who gets what, because we would all be able to get anything we want, except Alice. In our world today, the concept of property is a muddy one, with many connotations, many of them evil, so we need to work through the idea and understand exactly what property means for our purposes, and how it creates functionality within the sociome. We must separate the baby from the bathwater. Let's begin by reviewing what some notables have said about property. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote, "What we call real estate, the solid ground to build a house on, is the broad foundation on which nearly all the guilt of this world rests. A man will commit almost any wrong. He will heap up an immense pile of wickedness, as hard as granite, and which will weigh as heavily upon his soul to eternal ages, only to build a great, gloomy, dark-chambered mansion for himself to die in and for his posterity to be miserable in." Bathwater. Robert Ingersoll wrote, "Don't you know that if people could bottle the air they would? Don't you know that they would allow thousands and millions to die for want of breath if they could not pay for air?" Bathwater. George Bernard Shaw wrote, "Property is organized robbery." Bathwater. Bertrand Russell wrote, "It is preoccupation with possessions more than anything else that prevents men from living freely and nobly. Possession means taking or keeping some good thing which another is prevented from enjoying." Mostly bathwater. On the other hand, many people believe that observance of property rights is one of humankind's most civilizing practices. In a world of scarcity such as ours, if property rights are well defined, widely observed and honored, there would be fewer disputes over who gets what than in a world without property rights. Nobel Economics laureate Elinor Ostrom wrote, "When we see property simply as exclusion, we miss its moral and cooperative dimensions. Property can be a system of shared stewardship. She declared further, no single center of authority can adequately govern the many commons of the world. Property rights are human creations that evolve with the problems they are meant to solve. Baby, so much wisdom in those statements. And let us note that Russell made a glaring omission in his characterization of possession, an omission which is not surprising coming from a member of the British ruling class who himself had never engaged in production and commerce, and one which we must look at in all of its implications if we want to have a chance of developing deep understanding. He said that property means taking or keeping a good thing. What he failed to mention is that property can also mean, and more often than not does mean, producing a good thing. Objections to taking can be valid, but it is quite a different matter when keeping means each of us keeping the value we ourselves have created in the course of fair competition. If we believe in the right to life and the right to liberty, we ought also to believe in the right to property, because without such a right, the promises of the rights to life and liberty ring hollow. If someone has the authority to take our property, they have the power thereby to effectively take our liberty and ultimately our life. As John Adams wrote, property must be secured or liberty cannot exist. Let us then examine the concept of property more broadly and deeply and see if we can make sense of the concept in a way we can all find helpful. In a social order defined by hierarchy, think of a system of feudalism or life on a plantation. Authority, based on rank, preempts the choices of lower-ranked persons. The lord and master, and those to whom he has delegated authority, dictate who gets what for people of lesser rank. In a hierarchical society, you have takers and victims. In the social order defined by property, contractual arrangements among people who are equal by custom and or under the law determine who gets what under a system of pricing. In a property-based society, there are traders rather than takers and victims. The quotations above represent the thoughts of some of those who have speculated that perhaps we could have a functioning society without either property or hierarchy. They claim to believe that in an ideal world, people could exist by simply sharing what they produce. Think of John Lennon's wistful Imagine. This sounds nice, but it fails to address the problem of scarcity. In a society without either ownership or authority, how would scarce resources be rationed? You cannot just assume the problem away and make lofty, pious pronouncements about how everyone has a right to as much stuff as they need when they need it. If you were to add up everyone's needs, it would inevitably exceed how much stuff there is. Some have proposed that to make attainment of the ideal of common ownership more practicable, the state might own the means of production on behalf of the people and engage in top-down economic planning. Experiments along these lines in the recent past, however, have produced only poverty, tyranny, misery, and early death for the people unfortunate enough to have been the subjects of the experiments. The reasons for the failures of these experiments are now well understood, even if not universally accepted by the few remaining diehards, and lead to the conclusion that a system of state control of production coupled with economic planning can never work. What we now well understand is, first of all, that an economic planner cannot gather the necessary information as quickly and completely as a pricing system based on supply and demand. And secondly, that in a planned economy, the necessary incentives for individual behavior are absent and are often even perverse. And in the absence of effective natural incentives, the go-to incentive becomes coercion. And in a more general sense, what we now have reason to believe, due both to historical experience and to the study of natural systems, is that the sheer amount of complexity a planner would have to deal with is many orders of magnitude greater than we used to believe, and far greater than we can ever hope to deal with using authoritarian methods. It seems to me that proponents of common ownership are guilty of the commonly encountered means and ends fallacy. That is, the idea that we can choose the ends and, with sufficient authority, force the ends into existence. Whereas, in truth, we can only choose means directly, after which processes of evolution will determine the ends. And as for the idea that sharing is a viable substitute for hierarchy or property, it's also pretty certain that the thinkers of these ideas have not spent much time around young children. If you have spent time around children who have been taught that sharing is a major virtue, you have to have noticed that children are far more likely to apply the principle of sharing to other kids' stuff than to their own stuff. If they see something they want, they just invoke the not-to-be-questioned principle that the other child is supposed to share. Until the advocates of common ownership inhabiting our ivory towers come up with a workable method for coming to grips with scarcity, their arguments cannot be considered to have merit. Denotatively, the concept of property has a simple and straightforward meaning. Connotatively, there are multiple meanings. The word property conjures up different visions for different people. The simple and straightforward meaning is that property represents an agreement among people in a community to recognize and respect the exclusive right of another community member to use and dispose of some tangible or intangible asset. That is the definition of ownership. Things are seldom quite as simple in practice as described above, of course, because some uses of assets might create incidental effects, also known as externalities, which we then need to make part of the equation. In other words, actions an owner might take for the purpose of creating private benefits can create social costs. Think, for example, of adding a second story to your house, which is great for you, but might block your neighbor's view. It's likewise true that actions aimed at creating private benefits can create social benefits. Think, for example, of planting flowers and shrubs around your house, which is great for you and which your neighbors will also enjoy for free. The brilliant UCLA economist Harold Demsetz made a valuable, seminal contribution to thinking about the evolution of property rights. In a 1967 paper, Toward a Theory of Property Rights, he showed how private ownership can evolve from communal ownership as a way of dealing with externalities that arise from the communal use of a resource, such as land that is being used for hunting and gathering. In an analysis of a case study of Indian tribes in Labrador by anthropologist Eleanor Burke Leacock, he shows how and why ownership by individuals and families came into being in relation to hunting and trapping rights. His paper is a must-read for anyone seriously interested in the topic. The thesis of this paper is as follows. Just about any action by any individual in any type of society is going to have some effect, either harmful or beneficial, on a person or persons besides the individual taking the action. In a society based on the communal use of a resource, these harmful or beneficial effects will be just someone's tough luck or good luck, respectively, until the cost of doing nothing becomes greater than the cost of doing something to influence the person taking the action to take a different action. Bringing to bear a consideration of external effects on the decisions of the actor is called internalization. Internalization ideally takes the form of the emergence of a customary or legally enforced property right. As Demsetz states this crucial insight in his paper, property rights develop when the gains from internalization become larger than the cost of internalization. For example, think of a rural agricultural area where the population is sparse. In such circumstances, people would gather and burn whatever fuel was close at hand: wood, dried manure, peat, etc., for purposes of cooking and heating. Burning the fuel, in addition to providing energy for the home, uses resources that then become unavailable to others, and it produces smoke. Nobody has much of an incentive to do anything about these external effects as long as population remains sparse, because neighboring families are still able to find ample fuel for themselves, and the distant smoke of a few neighbors is not particularly bothersome. But as population becomes denser, the external effects of fuel usage begin to make more of a difference to the neighbors. Eventually, it becomes worth it to develop a custom or enact a statute that will internalize the costs. That is, to cause each user of fuel to take into account the effects of their use on others. For example, by limiting or pricing the gathering rights, and or by making the emission of smoke costly to the emitter. What about the argument put forward by many of the thinkers quoted above and first stated by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon that property is theft? I believe there actually is a defensible rationale behind this slogan, even though in the case of Proudhon and his contemporaries, it was nominally based on the now discredited labor theory of value. It is certainly possible to gain property by an act of theft, and history is not lacking in examples. But the idea that all property has been gained by acts of theft, or the idea that obtaining exclusive rights to use property itself constitutes theft, because of the exclusive part, we're getting a little silly. These are ideas that make sense only within ivory towers. So until someone figures out a way to make common ownership coupled with sharing work and practice, the choice is stark. Would you rather live in a society where the problem of scarcity is dealt with by queuing or forced rationing? Or would you rather live in a society where the problem of scarcity is dealt with by contractual arrangements under a system of pricing based on property rights? We cannot ignore the problem of scarcity, and if we try, reality will make itself felt. Reality does not just guide with an invisible hand. It also trips with an invisible foot. Coming next, Chapter 6, Learning from Game Theory.